Hello, it's week 22 of season 7 of the Andy Griffith Show. This week's episode title is Floyd's Barber Shop. Andy and Gooder are sitting in front of the barber shop talking about what each of them did last night. And then Harry Walker, the town real estate agent, comes and puts up the for sale sign on the building. The Goranson family has owned the place for 20 or 30 years, but they've been living in California and they decided to sell it. And the sign says the tenant, who is Floyd Larson in his barber shop, won't be disturbed. And Harry tries to convince Andy to buy it, and Andy says no. But Floyd, when he finds out, is worried that the new owner could make him move when his current lease is up. And Andy tells him that probably won't happen. And then they start reminiscing about Floyd's 28 years in that location, and about Andy coming in for haircuts when he was a little boy. And Floyd says he should have bought the building years ago when he had the money. He says it'll be interesting to see who buys it. And the next day, Mr. Walker brings Howard into the barber shop to look around. It turns out that Howard is thinking of buying it. And he assures Floyd that if he does, he'd want Floyd to stay on as a tenant. And then at the supper table, Andy tells Auntie and Aunt Dee that Howard is going to buy it, and he's going to be the legal owner in a week to 10 days. And Auntie says he wants to loaf in the barber shop when he gets older too, like his pa and the other guys. And Andy says it's not loafing. And at the closing table, the agent tells Howard that the taxes and insurance on the property have gone up, and he recommends to Howard that Howard raise Floyd's rent to negate those costs from $50 to $65. And when Floyd sees $65 in his new lease, he calls Howard a robber. And Howard says, I just want to make 5% on my investment. The costs have gone up. And Floyd says he refuses to pay it. And he calls Howard a scavenger, and he says he'll vacate the premises tomorrow. And he tears up the lease in front of Howard and Andy and Gooder and the mayor. And the next day, Floyd is moved out, and Howard puts up the for rent sign on front while Andy and Gooder are standing there. And he says he hopes to rent to another barber since the barber shop fixtures are staying. And Andy tells him Floyd is planning to open another barber shop in Mount Pilot. And Howard says he don't care. He thought Floyd was very rude yesterday. And later Goomer and the mayor start hanging around and playing checkers in the courthouse because the barbershop is no longer available, and that's where they used to hang out. And Andy's trying to work, and they're bothering him. And later, it's even more guys than that. Eating, reading, playing checkers, yelling, carrying on. And Andy gets mad because he can't do no work, and he leaves. Meanwhile, Aunt Dee is trying to cut Aunty's hair at home because Floyd's not available. And Andy comes home, and Aunty runs away from Aunt Dee, saying, Pa, please take me to Floyd and Mount Pilot for my haircut. So Andy gets mad being there, too, because it's so loud, and he goes back to town, where he sees Floyd sitting in a car. And Andy tries to get him to reconsider moving, and Floyd says no, it was time for a change after 28 years. But he looks at his old store, which is vacant, and we can see it in his facial expression that he's not totally convinced of what he just said. But Floyd drives off anyway. He says he's got business to attend to. And then Howard walks up, and he tells Andy he's got an appointment to show the vacant shop to a guy who owns a whole chain of barber shops. His name is Mr. Cofield. And he shows up, and he meets Andy and Howard, and he looks around the shop, and he says he'll renovate and modernize the place, and says he'll take down the community bulletin board, and he'll get rid of the checkers table. And he offers Howard $75 a month, and Howard says he'll think it over. And then Floyd comes back to town, and he's sitting on a bench in the courthouse with Andy, and he describes his new place, saying, although he says he hasn't actually signed the lease on it yet. And then Howard comes in. It turns out Andy had asked him to come by, and he had planned it this way, to get the two of them back together. And he makes Howard sit next to Floyd and shake hands with him. and he says they should at least do that before they part ways. And then he says they'll both be better off to part. They'll make more money than before. So then Howard and Floyd start getting defensive about the old place, saying the old place stood for friendship and tradition, and that's more important than money. Of course, this is what Andy was hoping to happen all along. So they meet each other halfway on the rent at 57.50. And when Opie hears this, he's mad that they didn't do this in the first place, because Aunt Dee had ended up getting a haircut after all. We'll see you next week for episode 23.